Hi, I'm Siraj Al-Ahmad. I'm a manager here on the full stack web engineering team here at Quizlet. And I want to tell you a little bit about Quizlet because as people of legal drinking age, you may not have heard of it. It's really popular in high school. Over half of high school students in the US use Quizlet. But that's not all. We have 30 million monthly active users. And over the years, they've created over 200 million study decks, sets of flashcards, and they've studied those over 3 billion times. So all that traffic adds up to, in peak months, being like one of the top 20 websites in the United States. But that's awesome, but what's really exciting for me is that when they're doing that and we're helping more people to do that, it's because they're learning, like their knowledge is growing. So that's really satisfying for me. And with our Series B, Quizlet is growing. We're reaching into new markets, and we're growing our engineering team. So, surprise, Quizlet is hiring. But that is not the reason for tonight's talks. We're here to learn about how you can engineer to help your product move faster and iterate through ideas productively. So our first talk is Jaclyn with how understanding the user can help your team to move fast. And that's
just control.
Yeah, I think space and the arrows.
Space and arrow. Okay. Hi everyone. Thanks for coming on a day with such unpredictable weather. My name is Jaclyn. I'm a software engineer focusing on iOS platform for about over 3 years. And I have been working on iOS development for about 4 to 5 years. And I definitely have come from sometimes not so happy product engineer to nowadays a much happier software engineer working on product. And so tonight I would like to share some of the things that I have learned during this transition. First, I would like to define what product ownership means. By being a product owner, I would like to say a stakeholder of the product and someone who genuinely cares about the product. For the first part of this talk, I would run through a few scenarios when engineers work on product, and then that will lead to some pain points, and I'll explain why is it better for engineers to have product ownership. After that, I'm going to share a few ways that have worked for me that help me take on more product ownership. So when engineers work on products, usually we are given some product specs. And usually it's kind of one way in the sense that if we feel like the shade of pink is a little too jarring, we don't really get a say to change it. And usually there's also a deadline. On mobile, we have code freeze. And there's usually some expected timeline that the product is being shipped. And something that happens to me a lot is when I'm looking at the product specs and I open the code base and I realize there are a lot of refactoring that has to be done before I can add this product spec to the code base. And usually one of these things could happen. The first is the product just launched perfectly and everyone was happy, but that's usually kind of unlikely. And so the second scenario is during the development cycle, there are issues that came up either from the product side or the engineering side that were not foreseen during the planning stage. And that's when the launch could be delayed or engineers or product team run into crunch time. Or sometimes the deadline is non-negotiable. For example, when the founder is going on CNBC, announcing to the world that this feature will be available at the end of the day, then in engineering world, there's hardly anything that's impossible. But when there's a hard deadline, we have to come up with creative and sometimes hacky ways to make the product work on time. And that usually turns into tech debt. So from the examples above, we could kind of see some pain points when engineers work on product. And there could be a lot of frustration built up from constant product and design changes. And from the company, unrealistic expectation on the deadline and when we're writing code, are trying to protect it. So when engineers have product ownership, there's usually a lot more motivation, and we understand more on why product team made these decisions. And it's also not just good for not for higher team morale or happier individuals. It's also better for the company because now the products are going to be more thought out, and it will have input from both engineering and product sides. Now I'm going to share a few processes that have worked for me to take on more product ownership. This is how the product development cycle usually looks like. It will start with the feature planning stage, followed by the development stage, and then the launch. During the planning stage, the product team usually owns these few items. And something that I found that's really helpful is for the product team to share why we're building this feature. And usually there are a lot of internal and external reasons that went into the product decision, and some are not very obvious. So when the product team shares this with the engineering team, there will be a lot more understanding, because it definitely happens to me a lot when I didn't really agree with the product decisions, but after hearing why and how this tied to the team OKRs, a lot of things make sense. On the engineering side, we'll also start estimating the work based on the requirements at this stage and communicate clearly to the product team what's feasible. And also during this planning stage, if both are starting to think about the plans, then there's more room for change in this planning stage. And also, engineers usually come up with some design on how they will implement the feature. And I'll let you drill into engineering design a little more. In my personal experience, engineering design is very valuable during the planning stage, because this time we can take more input from the product team and also from the rest of the engineering team and even the company. There are a few ways that we can win on the engineering side during the planning stage to have a design that allows future changes. So when I just started out being a product engineer, I was very junior, and I would just build something just for this feature. And a few months later, the feature might have gone well, and we're adding more functionality to it. And I'll realize lots of things will break, or it's just very hard to add things to it. So having a design that is flexible and easily pullable, removable, or adjustable is a big win for the future. On the other hand, sometimes perfect engineering solution might mean a lot more time to build, and this might not be the best solution when the feature has not been validated yet. So there's a fine balance between the velocity and a perfect engineering solution, and it heavily depends on the case. So after the planning stage, we go to the development stage, when engineers work on the code based on the design, do bug fixes, and the product team will usually own the design QA and clarify on any missing requirements. And something we do at Quizlet that I found very helpful is to have QA parties. This is when people from both sides will come together, usually with treats, and we will QA the product at various milestones. And this is when we can discover some bugs earlier, and sometimes even product team could discover some UX flows that would make the product work even better. So overall, it helps polish the product. After the launch stage, usually product team would monitor the data and make data-driven decisions. On the engineering side, we'll do bug fixes, and it would be nice when we have some time to clean out our tech debt, hopefully none. And something I feel very excited to look at after the launch is user feedback. And that will lead to my next part of the product ownership, is to connect with the users. We at Quizlet, we have this user ops hour when engineers are able to respond to some user cases. And this is when I found very eye-opening when I was able to talk to users like a 70-year-old, 40-year-old, or 7 years old. They all have very different points of views, and the way they see the product and issues are very different. Also, we could observe use cases in real life, if possible. So at Quizlet, we do class visits to public and private schools, and we see how the students and teachers are using the product. And it's also very eye-opening for me to see how technology is used in schools differently. And because we're all out of school at various times, and so it is very important for me to see how our users at very different demographics are using our app. And this is also when we'll do some user study that we talk to users about maybe some upcoming products and do some interviews. Next thing is experiments. Nowadays, it's very easy to do some data analysis. And something I found very valuable is to run some basic data queries and communicate with the product team. For example, when I'm talking to designer about some iPad layout, I would usually pull out some data, for example, like the iPhone versus iPad usage, and that really helps us make better product decisions. Finally, I would like to say, become a user, and it's always possible. I would like to hear any counterexample, if you have any. And this is very important for me. And an example that I felt this way is we have a lot of users who wrote in about we have this writing learning mode where you type answers and we will tell you you got to answer right or wrong. And the users are saying a lot of times when I had typos or capitalization errors, then they will get the answer wrong. And my first instinct would just be, then maybe you should not have typos. And because it's testing your writing. But it's not until I personally use a product and I was typing on my iPhone 6 and I realized how difficult it is to type without typos on an iPhone 6, not to mention iPhone 5. So a lot of the pain points become really heartfelt. And also working on a product that you personally use just make you relate to the product a lot more. To summarize the talk, we kind of ran through a few processes during the product development cycle. And there are 3 key things that I would like to highlight. The first thing is communications. The product and engineering team had to be on the same page, and the best way is for them to communicate about each other's concerns, and they will understand where they come from, and then that would help us polish the product even more. And the second key thing is patience. There are definitely a lot of times that I feel impatient when the product specs or designs keep changing during the development cycle. But on the other side, the product team also constantly wait on engineers to fix this bug or that launch blocker in order to ship. So there's definitely patience required on both sides. And overall, collaboration is very important for both sides to realize they work together to build a better product. And then they can hear each other out, and they build trust among each other. And bearing in mind that they all work toward the same goal to make the product better. That's all I have. I'll take any questions. Yes,
Jaclyn, you mentioned, there was one slide where you mentioned kind of on the one hand, sometimes it's more important to validate a feature than to build it maybe in the best possible way. I wondered just...
This one?
Yeah, like what's maybe an example of this, and how do you decide where you're going to go?
An example is, so sometimes if you want a perfect engineering solution, it might take 1,000 lines of diffs, and that might take maybe a month to build that perfect engineering solution. And another alternative is to have a simpler solution. Maybe it might have fewer product requirements or a little hackier code, but it will be built in a way that in the future, if you want to remove it fully, then it's easy, and then you can make changes. So that's the point of the engineering design. Does that answer your question? Yes.
Do you have any ways of, do you guys ever use like product switches that can enable features?
Oh, like feature flags and A/B tests? Yeah, we do it by default. Yeah, so for every feature we're launching, we have feature flag. And the product team also will come up with some variants that we run for every new feature. For example, like different user flows or different kinds of UI, so that we can pick after a few months like which works for the users the best. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Do you write any unit tests or UI tests?
Yes, we do. At least on iOS, we do unit tests that should be the lowest level. And whenever there's anything functional, we do unit tests. And on top of that, we also have UI tests to test individual screens. And on top of that, we have a little fewer, but also integration tests that will basically test the whole flow of maybe multiple screens or like running the whole login or that kind of flows that require network.
Do you do it even for the features that you hack together?
Especially for the feature that we had together, having tests to make sure if something changes, nothing else will break is very important. Also, we definitely have priority of testing on different screens or different features. For example, like a key flow like login or sign up, we definitely don't want to break. And whenever we're adding any feature, we'll make sure those key flows have been tested. Yes.
You mentioned that one of the ways that you make your engineers product owners is they're using the product, right, to test it out and understand the pain points. Do you have any suggestions or best practices for situations where the engineers have become so familiar with the product that they are not seeing the pain?
Oh, that's a very good question. So that's definitely possible. And I would like to highlight that especially us, we should never think that we represent most of the users, that most of the users would not use the product the same way as we do. And so bearing that in mind, we would probably want to hear more users outside of our circles, how they use the product, and maybe do some real life use like user study or some observe how they use in real life. And
How does your iOS team work with the Android and web teams?
like how we work in the product development? Yeah, so at Quizlet, we actually do cross-platform planning, and the product team share the product plans for all web, Android, and iOS during our planning. And it is actually very helpful to have cross-platform planning because we get to ask each other how they will implement and any constraints that they can think of on each platform.
So you would launch sometimes on one platform before others, I'm guessing?
Yeah, the goal is definitely to launch at the same time, but there's always feature imparity, so one might get more ahead of the other. But launching all platforms is always the goal. Yes.
Do you use any kind of like analytics to, like after a release, to watch how a feature is being, like how well it's working, or like even detecting usability problems?
Yeah, so for every feature, we will have specs on how we will track like the user behaviors or how the usage, like all the flow, like funnels, or some dashboards that we will build. And usually the product team will own this part, but the engineers will implement the actual logging and anything that supports the analytics. Yeah, this is very important for us to make data-driven decisions because like we would never know how the majority of users would use the new feature, and so it's very important to do data analytics on that.
Time for one more question.
Yes.
So I'm curious if you could give an example of a feature or design that was very engineering driven, whether or not they came from user studies or just engineers using the app itself.
Like the feature is coming from engineer.
Yeah, or just like that the kind of like back and forth between product and engineering.
Oh, interesting. So I have a very tiny example that comes from a hackathon. That so I used the app to study Japanese, and so I would when I was doing the written questions, I would have to switch keyboard back and forth between Japanese and English. And I went to the iOS developer conference last year, and I heard during a session that you can actually define you can set some identifier for your screen to tell the keyboard to show whatever the language that user was less used. And so that kind of inspired me to just do something simple during the hackathon, and then we actually shipped that, and then we got some user feedback that really liked this feature. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Jaclyn, and thanks to everyone for those questions.